For 5 years, Elijah Moore pushed his cart through the echoing hallways of the towering glass building that housed Halston Global. The Fortune 500 marketing empire, known for its sleek ads, cold corporate culture, and top-floor power players who rarely made eye contact with the staff below them. To most, he was invisible. A shadow gliding through the after-hours silence with a mop in one hand and quiet dignity in the other every night. He cleaned the same offices, emptied the same trash cans, wiped the same glass doors that gleamed. By morning, all while humming old jazz tunes that reminded him of his grandfather's vinyls. Long gone, but never forgotten. Elijah wasn't bitter at least not anymore, though he once wore ambition like armor. Having graduated from Howard University with honors, fluent in 3 languages, and once on track for a diplomatic career before family tragedy forced him to stay behind, caring for his ill mother, raising his sister's children after she passed, and working whatever job kept food on the table. Janitorial work paid less than his potential, but it gave him time to think, and in those late hours, while others slept, he would sometimes pause in front of the office, belonging to Halston's rising star VP, Claire Whitmore, a woman whose name was whispered with awe and fear in the same breath. Known for her ruthless work ethic, ivory tower intellect, and surgically precise ambition, Elijah saw her only in glimpses her back as she hunched over reports late into the night, her reflection in the glass as she paced during strategy calls, her perfectly arranged desk that told him everything about her, efficient, calculated, and sterile. She never said hello, never looked up when he entered to clean, though sometimes he wondered if she noticed the fresh flowers he left from time to time, picked from the overgrown garden behind his cousin's house, wrapped in paper, towels, and stuck in a mug on her windowsill. She never moved them, never tossed them out, and that small detail kept Elijah humming as he worked. Then one night it changed. Claire sat in her chair, unmoving, shoulders tense, eyes distant, the glow of the city bouncing off her window, casting her in light that made her look less like a warrior and more like a woman who hadn't slept in days. And Elijah, breaking his own code of invisibility, softly asked, "Long day," expecting no reply. But she blinked, startled, then turned on. For the first time in 5 years, their eyes met. What she saw was not a janitor, but a man with weathered strength, patient eyes, and something else she couldn't quite name. And what he saw was a woman on the edge of something, not the kind of edge you fall off, but the kind you leap from. She said nothing, not then, but the next night she waited for him. When he arrived, cart squeaking down the hall, she turned her chair toward him and said the words that neither of them expected, but both would remember forever. "Can we start right here?" And that moment, born of silence in 5 years, of passing like ghosts, became the ignition for something greater than either of them could have imagined. Elijah stood frozen in the doorway of Claire Whitmore's office, the mop in his hand forgotten, the question she had just asked, "Can we start right here?" hanging in the air like a note suspended in a jazz solo that hadn't quite resolved. And though he had stood in this room hundreds of times before, emptied her trash, dusted her desk, wiped the smudges from her polished window, he had never felt like he belonged in her presence, until now, when she invited something he didn't fully understand, and neither did she, if she was being honest. Claire didn't know what compelled her to speak to pause her ever-churning mind, built from discipline and efficiency and shielded by 1,000 corporate battles. But there was something in the stillness of that night, in the unspoken calm, that followed Elijah's presence that made her want to strip away the performance and just be, if only for a moment. She gestured gently to the empty seat across from her desk, and Elijah, unsure, looked behind him to make sure she meant him. And when she nodded again, slower this time, he walked in and sat down, no longer the janitor, no longer invisible, but a man with a story waiting to be heard. Claire stared at him, this stranger she had seen every night for years, but never truly seen. And she said, "I don't know your name." "Elijah," he replied softly. "Elijah Moore." The quiet conversation began. It wasn't dramatic, not yet, just to people unlearning assumptions. Peeling back the layers they'd worn for too long, Claire, the perfectionist daughter of a Wall Street legend, trained since childhood to measure her worth by achievement and productivity. And Elijah, once a scholarship star with diplomatic dreams, who gave everything up to keep his fractured family together after a car crash killed his sister and left his mother barely able to speak, let alone care for herself. They talked in ripples, not waves about. Books she loved, strategy manuals, he loved Baldwin. About coffee, she drank it black, he didn't touch it. About silence, he cherished it. She feared it, and slowly, over the course of several nights, Claire learned that Elijah could, quote, Maya Angelou from memory, had a deep knowledge of global politics, and had once helped a group of teenagers in his neighborhood start a community garden to keep them out of trouble. Elijah, in turn, learned that Claire hated being called Ice Queen, that she once dreamed of opening a nonprofit before her father shut that dream down, with a cold smirk and a signed check for law school, and that the reason she worked so hard wasn't just legacy, it was loneliness. Every night, after that first conversation, Claire stayed a little later, and Elijah came a little earlier. And their talks unfolded like old songs rediscovered, something ancient and new all at once. And though they never touched, never crossed any obvious lines, the office became a sacred space, a confessional, a room where two weary souls could drop their masks and speak plainly. But of course, nothing that pure stays hidden forever. And whispers began to stir, first from the night staff, then from the security desk, and finally from the HR department, whose members lived to squash anything that didn't fit within clean boxes and color-coded policies. Claire heard it during a meeting when a senior partner asked with a smirk, "Are we paying you for late-night therapy sessions now?" And she realized, with sudden clarity, that the world above didn't understand the world she had discovered. Below, Elijah saw it too. One night, his badge didn't work, and a younger, more aggressive janitor had been added to his shift, clearly there to keep an eye on him, to remind him of his place. But the seeds had already been planted, and even if no one else could see them yet, something was growing between Claire and Elijah. Connection, built not on romance or rebellion, but something deeper, mutual recognition, respect the sacred, kind that forms when one human sees the full humanity in another. And on a rainy Thursday night, after a long silence, Claire leaned across her desk, eyes soft but unshaken, and said, "Elijah, I don't want to keep pretending." He looked at her, steady. "Neither do I." And just like that, something shifted again, this time not just between them, but within them. They hadn't said what they were yet, but they both knew, whatever it was, it had already begun. Right here, the shift came slowly, like a tide creeping up the shore unnoticed, until the ground beneath your feet is soaked after. Claire and Elijah's quiet bond began to blossom in the unseen corners of Halston Global's pristine top floor. The building itself seemed to lean in and listen, the fluorescent lights flickering like nervous whispers, and the polished glass reflecting more than just power suits and deadlines. Suddenly, the invisible man had a name on the lips of people who'd never bothered to know him. And Claire, once revered for her robotic precision, started doing the unthinkable, arriving early just to sit in her own office and read Elijah's favorite authors, leaving quotes on post-its taped beneath her desk where only he would find them, changing the layout of her space to make it feel less like a battlefield and more like a sanctuary. Of course, the walls had ice. Corporate culture doesn't digest change easily, especially not when it's messy, human, and unapproved by protocol. So, murmurs grew into meetings, and meetings birthed memos, and soon Claire was being called in to discuss professionalism, where thinly veiled questions were asked about her emotional bandwidth, her objectivity, her connection with janitorial staff, as though she had caught a disease from looking too deeply into another human soul. She didn't flinch. She stared her superior down and said simply, "If kindness is unprofessional, I'm in the wrong place." Meanwhile, Elijah endured his own silent storm. Other janitors avoided him, unsure whether he was betraying the unspoken rule of invisibility or ascending into dangerous visibility. And when his pay was mysteriously docked due to restructuring, he didn't complain. He only worked harder because he understood something Claire was only beginning to grasp. The system was built to keep people like him out of sight, unheard and expendable. But where most saw risk, Claire saw responsibility if she could sit in meetings, shaping multi-million-dollar narratives. She could damn well stand for one man who had cleaned her office and unclouded her soul. So she began taking steps that no one expected. She formally requested to oversee janitorial operations as part of a new internal culture initiative. drafted a proposal that integrated night staff perspectives into building management feedback loops, and when challenged, presented data showing how employee morale improved in departments where night crews felt seen and respected. Using Elijah's floor as the shining example, it was radical not just for what it did, but for what it represented. Someone from the top choosing to lift someone from the bottom, not with pity, but with partnership. Elijah, for his part, stayed grounded, never letting her fight alone, but also never stepping into the spotlight she was now being scorched under. Their conversations continued, deeper now, touching on race, power, purpose, and what it meant to be whole in a world that only valued fragments of a person. He told her about his nephew Darnell, a bright teen sliding toward trouble because the schools treated him like a statistic, not a seed. She shared how her therapist once told her she had built an empire on fear of failure, and how exhausted she was from guarding the castle she never even wanted. One night, after an especially brutal day of boardroom battles, Claire sat with Elijah in silence, her eyes brimming but her voice steady, and asked, "What if we built something new, not from the top down, but from the heart out?" And that night, everything changed. Not because they kissed, they didn't. Not because they made a grand declaration, they hadn't yet. But because Elijah pulled a folded paper from his pocket, one he'd written years ago, a nonprofit proposal for a mentorship program that bridged inner-city youth with professionals from industries they never imagined entering. And Claire read it with trembling hands, looked up, and said, "This is better than half the projects I've funded," he chuckled, half shy, half challenging. "Then let's start right here." And this time, when she said it, it wasn't a question, it was a vow. The next day, Claire made it her mission. Elijah wasn't just a janitor anymore, he was a partner in purpose, and together they would find a way to turn 5 years of silent recognition into a movement that could crack open the walls that had long kept voices like his muffled beneath polished surfaces. And somewhere beneath the hum of copier machines and the tick of boardroom clocks, the building listened again because it knew, even if the people didn't yet, that change was no longer coming quietly. By the time spring light poured through the 50th floor windows like hope breaking through old grief, Elijah and Claire had become more than just a quiet anomaly in the corporate machine. They were momentum, undeniable and magnetic, and unlikely. Alliance stitched together by late-night truths, a mutual fire to uplift what had been ignored, and the audacity to believe that real change could come not from speeches, but from listening, from showing up for each other with fierce integrity, from choosing to rebuild the foundation instead of repainting the rot tanned. So they did, step by radical step. Claire, once known as the icy architect of bulletproof deals, now walked into conference rooms with fire in her chest and purpose in her voice, introducing the Right Here Project, a bold initiative that partnered with Elijah's forgotten nonprofit dream, now reborn as a fully funded program aimed at mentoring underrepresented youth, hiring from within overlooked communities, and transforming janitorial and service staff into a respected workforce pipeline with real upward mobility. The announcement made headlines not just because of what it did, but who did it. And when reporters asked Claire why she'd pivoted her career away from acquisitions and billion-dollar accounts, she answered with 6 simple words that would echo far beyond Wall Street: "I met someone who was invisible." But not everyone applauded. Executives grumbled about distractions. Old guard board members threatened to vote her out, and whispers of soft leadership slithered through the halls like venom in search of a vein. They said she was risking everything for a janitor. What they didn't understand was Elijah wasn't a janitor. He was a visionary who had survived, endured, and quietly changed lives long before she ever noticed. And now, standing beside her, he was changing the world with her, not for her. Their partnership, unromantic, unorthodox, yet intimate in the truest sense, became a lightning rod. Darnell, Elijah's once troubled nephew, was now the first youth rep on the mentorship board. Several former cleaning staffers were promoted into office roles after training programs Elijah helped design. One woman who had never spoken to an executive in a decade now ran HR for support staff. And Claire, she had never smiled more because she wasn't just doing good, she was living right. It all culminated one unforgettable evening when Halston Global's annual summit opened with a surprise. Keynote, not from a billionaire, but from Elijah Moore, whose calm voice cut through the sleek opulence of the ballroom like a scalpel of truth, telling the story of a young boy who used to dream of diplomacy but ended up pushing mops in silence. Until one night, a woman looked up from her mountain of work and finally saw him. And when she asked me, "Can we start right here?" he said to a room frozen in breath, "I realized I didn't have to be anywhere else to make a difference. Right here, this floor, this office, this moment was enough to begin." The applause didn't explode. It rose like reverence, like awakening. And Claire, standing in the wings with eyes shining, knew something deeper than pride. She knew legacy. Not the kind engraved on buildings, but the kind etched into hearts, into systems shaken awake, into people who finally knew they mattered. The next morning, a new plaque appeared beside the staff elevator, the Elijah Moore Fellowship for Emerging Voices, and no one dared mock it, because the building had changed. Not just its policies, but its soul. And one morning, months later, Claire stepped into her office, now filled with sunlight, student sketches, and quiet hope, and found Elijah standing there not to clean, but to meet her, not to serve, but to lead. They smiled, no need for words, because they both knew no matter where life carried them next, they had already done the impossible. They started right here.